welcome back. In this video, I'm going to be going through my question 3 response step by step. For context, I got an A* overall, and for this question, I scored 30 out of 36, and I sat the OCR A-Level English Language Paper 1 in 2023. Just for a little bit of background information, for this question, Text B was a transcript from the Build series, which is an American television program where celebrities are interviewed in front of a studio audience of fans. This episode was shown in 2018. And Text C is the opening of an online Radio Times article reviewing the series Doctor Who. It was published in November 2017. The two reviewers, Flora Carr and Mark Braxton, are both professional critics. So I'll be sort of working through my response. I'll be explaining my reasoning, and I'll also be adding an input from the examiner's report that was published, and I'll also be sort of referring to additional resources that I used to prepare for my A-levels, just to give you guys sort of the best possible way that you can answer this question and approach this question. So you can see here at the top, I've done a rough sort of plan, and that's really just for my own benefit, and I think it would just be really useful just to spend a few minutes before you start writing, just sort of having out this sort of rough plan, just so that you can sort of really make sure that you're not missing any parts of the language levels. You're sort of covering everything that you need to cover, and you know, for example, you don't want to focus too heavily just on discourse or just on sentences. You want to have sort of a wide enough variety so that you can get all the marks that you deserve. And also it just means that, you know, you understand which points you're going to be using for which paragraph, and so you're not repeating yourself or not having any sort of quotes or evidence to draw on, because it's really important that you keep referring back to the text and picking out those pieces of information. So just to get started, I'm just going to start out by reading my response and then explaining sort of my reasoning and how I got to that response. In terms of discourse structure, it's clear that both Text B and C have a unique structure, with Text B maintaining a continuous question and answer discourse. For example, host AG's utterances mainly composed of interrogatives, like, let's start with just asking, like, how would you? The use of imperative let's guides the conversation and allows the host to set the agenda. The use of contracted plural noun us in let us mitigates the imperatives and allows AG to maintain politeness whilst also ensuring that he's fulfilling his role of allowing his primary audience, JW, to know when to engage in turn taking, and allowing his secondary audience, the viewers, to know where the conversation is heading. Notably in this text, JW holds the conversational floor, which is indicated by the large paragraph of text. This may be evidence that in a politically correct society, theories of male dominance may no longer be relevant in speech, since there's greater equality between men and women. It could also be due to the context of production, which is the fact that the viewers want to hear more about the star, JW, than anyone else, which dictates the discourse structure and who receives priority. So obviously you can see in this text, just in this one text, although I started off mentioning discourse structure, I then blend and include a lot of points, but in detail, because I go on to talk about, so in terms of discourse, I talked about that unique structure, that continuous question and answer structure, and the interrogatives, but then I go on into sort of lexis, where I talk about contracted plural noun, and I've been there as specific as possible, I've been as specific as I possibly could be, because I've said contracted plural noun, and then I've talked about the mitigated imperative, and then I've linked that onto spoken language and the theories of spoken language, which is politeness, and also the conversational floor, so who's holding the conversational floor, and then I've also been very specific as to who is the primary audience, which is JW, which is the celebrity that is being interviewed, and I've also then talked about the secondary audience, and actually, rather than just saying, oh, the audience, I've been very, very specific about there's a primary audience and there's a secondary audience, and there's different sort of purposes that are being fulfilled by each of those respective audiences. And it's really important to recognise that, especially when it's spoken language, you can sort of simplify it and say, oh, there is a, you know, I could have just referred to AG and JW or AG in the audience and been really, really superficial, but actually by just going into it and dissecting it that little bit further, you're adding in that extra layer of depth, which is really important. And then I've gone on to talk about this concept and this theory about male dominance and sort of language and gender, and I've really beautifully blended that in towards the end. And once I've talked about that sort of theory about sort of male dominance, I then return back to the fact that it's just dictating the discourse structure and who receives priority. So I've not sort of strayed too far away from the language, because you don't want to go sort of into a rabbit hole and ramble about, theories and philosophies and things like that. You want to obviously make sure that you're staying on track. So moving on to the next paragraph, text C, on the other hand, has a unique discourse structure, with the Radio Times staff introducing the text almost like a host before assigning separate sections for Carr and Braxton, almost like an interview. The use of the elliptical sentences in the introduction, and some of their sentences may surprise you, adds an almost conversational tone, foreshadowing the critic's review. The use of subheadings to distinctly signpost Carr and Braxton's respective sections is almost reminiscent of turn-taking in spoken language, and works to add a dynamic and varied structure, which may be more appealing to a wider, younger audience who are more used to listening to multiple reviews/thoughts on social media. This could be an example of Elizabeth Day's technology theory, which suggests technology shapes our language and the way we write. So obviously it's really important to remember that for this question 3, it is compare and contrast. So you are looking for both similarities and differences between the texts. And obviously I've talked on the fact that text C does have a unique discourse structure. It's a written text, and it's an article, so it's not an interview. But even then, I've looked for similarities, because you can't just talk about differences for the whole response. You can't just write a question 3 response just talking about the differences. You do need to talk about similarities, even if there are differences within the similarities. Address that. Talk about that. So I've talked about the fact that there is that question and answer, which is almost sort of reminiscent of that sort of spoken language, and I'm drawing that similarity there. But then I am actually, I'm not trying to I'm not reaching and sort of trying to don't try and make things up that aren't really there, because I'm being realistic. I'm talking about the fact that actually it's still an article. And there are separate sections for Carr and Braxton, almost like an interview. So again, that's another sort of similarity, because in text B we had AG and JW, which is just the abbreviation, the initials of the interviewer and the celebrity, and then here we have Braxton and Carr. Then I talked about the elliptical sentences, and adding that sort of conversational tone into the article. So even though it's a written piece of text, which is a difference, there is similarity in the sense that it's conversational, it's more sort of informal, and then I've in the end I've sort of added in sort of that context, as well as, so the context is the fact that it's a younger, wider audience. So constantly I'm thinking about genre, audience, purpose, gap. So what's the genre, who's the audience, what is the purpose of this text, and then going back to sort of this concept, this idea, this theory of Elizabeth Day's technology theory, and that concept of the fact that we're being this sort of technology-based society, we are used to hearing lots and lots of different thoughts and ideas rather than just listening to one voice continually. Moving on to the next paragraph. Both texts use sentences differently due to their varying context of production. Text B makes use of a range of sentence types, with AG mainly using interrogatives anchored by declaratives like "you mentioned in a recent interview," and "I'm going to be honest with you." This is a common genre convention used by talk show hosts, since it allows them to provide context and grounding not only for the primary audience, JW and CC, but also for secondary audience, who may need to be informed about the latest news in regards to the celebrity, so that they're not alienated/confused when it comes to the questions. This is an example of speakers, AG, accommodating his audience. Notably, when AG uses interrogatives, he can be seen softening his speech at times. For example, he uses the following declarative: "I wondered about your approach in one scene to ask Jodie about her acting." The softened question allows AG to ask the question in a way that won't appear to be a face-threatening act. AG may be wary of politeness features, since JW has greater influential power over him. JW uses a range of sentence types, including minor sentences comprised of non-fluency features like "oh." This may be because text B is spoken language and is composed of largely spontaneous speech. However, JW uses a pattern of complex sentences with embedded clauses like "when you say." When you say it like that, it can seem as if it's limiting, but actually it's the opposite, because it's so I don't actually know what I've written there. And because this may be because, as the celebrity guest, her primary audience, AG, as well as her secondary audience, viewers, are expecting her to provide information and exclusive insight into filming, which can be best achieved by complex sentences, since they allow a density of points. So that's a really, really sort of sort of dense paragraph that I've written. There's lots to unpack here. So I talk about the fact that, so I'll go on to talk about sentences. So again, just be really, really clear that you're talking about, when you're talking about discourse, say it clearly. When you're talking about sentences, say that you're talking about sentences clearly. When you're talking about lexis, mention that clearly so you can be credited for that. And I've talked about the varying context of production. So you kind of want to, you don't want to have really separate paragraphs. So some people, in some sort of weaker responses, I remember in class when we used to look at weaker responses, they would be sort of really black and white, and you'd have like one paragraph on context, one standalone paragraph on sort of like concepts, one standalone paragraph on language. So rather than having these standalone paragraphs that don't really make a lot of sense, that aren't really interlinked, you want to try and blend all that information together to see how it works together and how it's sort of like a cake almost, with all the different layers. And so when you're talking about text B, I'm talking about a range of sentence types. So I've talked about the interrogatives, but I've not talked too much about the interrogatives, because I did mention the interrogatives in a previous sort of paragraph. So then I go on to talk about the declaratives and being anchored in the declaratives. And then I've talked about the fact that it's a genre convention. So although I've talked about the declaratives, which is it's the sort of the lexis, and that's sort of A1, and that's me sort of applying appropriate methods of language analysis associated with terminology and coherent written expression, right? But then I've also linked that across to A03, which is analysing and evaluating how contextual factors and language features are associated with the construction of meaning. So I've done A01, A03, so just sort of triangulating that response. And then A04, which is also important in this question, is analysing and evaluating how contextual factors and language features are associated with the construction of meaning. So it's having that sort of the language analysis, the context and the connection between the text and also the concepts. So you're looking at all those three AOs. And I've talked about sort of, again, going back to the audience. But even when I go back to the audience, I'm sort of each time I'm bringing out different points of why the audience is relevant. So I don't just keep repeating the same point. So in here, I'm talking about how the fact that you don't want to alienate the audience because they might not necessarily know the latest news. So AJ is repeating things and he's accommodating his audience. And I've also talked about softening of the speech, which again is sort of spoken language theory. I've also talked about over here the politeness feature and the influential power, which again is a concept, and the fact that obviously JW is a celebrity, so she has that more influential power. And then I've talked about the minor sentences, why are the minor sentences used, and it's a non-fluency feature, and we see these non-fluency features typically in spoken text because it's spontaneous. Again, that's sort of going into the context and why it's being said. So the purpose of the text, and then I've gone on later there to talk about the sort of the complex sentences that is used by JW, and that's obviously for her to provide that information to her secondary audience, and it allows sort of more points, density of points, which again is going into why is she using, rather than just saying, okay, she's using these complex sentences, these embedded clauses, why is she using that, and it's sort of exploring that for a little bit of context. Okay, moving on to the next paragraph. So here again, so I've just talked in the previous paragraph about the sentence types, and here I'm talking in text C. The radio staff team use sentence types to create an informal tone. For example, through the use of fronted conjunctions like "but how" is a series, and imperative sentences which directly address the reader. Check out the full collection, some of which have been edited. The use of the parenthetical aside, that's just a fancy way of saying, the phrase in the brackets, providing inside information of the text production include the reader and reduces the reader-writer relationship. Notably, both Carr and Braxton make use of complex sentences. For example, Carr uses the conditional left-branching multi-clausal sentence: if a costume from a new TV show features heavily come Halloween, it's a pretty good. The use of this sentence forwards the cultural impact of the show, which allows Carr to pragmatically imply the new series has been a success. As a professional critic, Carr may be wary that readers don't just want to be informed, but also entertained. She does this through the use of referencing events outside the immediate topic. However, both Carr and Braxton make use of hyphenated sentences like, but of course, the truth is Whittaker herself. No, sorry, the true icon is Whittaker herself. Sorry, my handwriting has shocked me there. And Braxton, My wife and kids have come back to the show, and that speaks volumes. The use of the hyphenated sentence to provide extra personal information is a way for Braxton to add a sense of personal voice to the text, which his regular readers may look for and could be evidence of the information informalisation theory over time. So in this sort of paragraph, I've gone on to talk about, again, it's a written text, but I'm talking about how the fact that they've used sentences to create an informal tone. Again, which it's a difference because it's a written text and they're using sentences to create that, but the similarity is the fact that it's an informal tone which is sort of in parallel to spoken language. And then even though it's sentences that I'm talking about, I've also not miss the opportunity to include the lexis. So I've talked about, obviously the fronted conjunction, and then I've also, here I've talked about the parenthetical side, which is part of sort of sentences and structure. And I've talked about another part of the sentences is the conditional left branching multi-clausal sentence. And I go on sort of to talk about as much as I can in terms of over here I've got that sort of that left branching multi-clausal sentence, and then also the fact that they've used hyphenated sentences, and that those hyphenated sentences provide that extra personal information, which is allowing the writer to add that sort of personal voice. And again, that they're talking about the personal voice is sort of drawing out another similarity between the two texts. So sort of that adding that personality, adding that character through sort of that speech-like character of text C. So that's sentence is done. Now moving on to lexis. Lexically, it's clear that both texts make use of lexis to create a mixed register. For example, in text C, AG uses the assured negative, I'm not gonna give spoilers, I promise. By creating humour through the cultural reference of spoilers, which is very much a modern idea, AG entertains the audience and creates a relationship with them by implying he's considering their viewing experience. CC engages in collaborative overlapping, saying, you really aren't. This may be a sign of speaker support since CC observed the audience's laughter and creates an adjacency pair with AG to play on his humour for that further. Additionally, the use of non-standard lexis like elision, e.g. gonna, and the dropped G in having, could be an example of dialect and evidence of the celebrities downwardly converging to relate to their wider audience. It could also be evidence of accent pride, where JW is emphasising her regional accent in the context of an American show. So even though I'm talking about lexis in this paragraph, again I'm talking about how lexis is used to create a mixed register in both texts. So even though both texts might be using lexis in different ways, the similarity is that they've used lexis and they've purposely sort of created and crafted that lexis to create a mixed register. And then I've talked about the assured negative, and then going on to talk about the cultural reference of spoilers, which is a modern idea, and that's a concept that I've integrated into this paragraph. And then I'm talking about sort of that the collaborative overlapping and an adjacency pair, which is sort of specific terminology that is coming from spoken language and theories from spoken language. Again, I've gone on to talk about non-standard lexis, and that's another sort of AO1 point. And then I've talked about, but the humour here, the adjacency pair and the humour, that is an AO3 point, so that's context. And you can see the examiners mark that as well. And we've talked about the celebrities downwardly converging, which is a theory, and the fact that they have that accent pride as well, which is again a theory from spoken language. Now moving on to the next paragraph. However, text C also creates a formal aspect to the register through the use of French, Latinate, and polysyllabic lexis like mercurial, extraordinary, hindsight. I can't actually read that because it's covered, and the pre-modified noun phrase past regenerations. This creates a more educated register, which may be necessary to fulfil the interview's secondary purpose of persuading viewers to watch the show and informing them of all the serious hard work that went into producing the show, which is intended to add the positive press/publicity of the show. So obviously, I started off that paragraph by talking about the mixed register, and so I've addressed already sort of the informal register, so it's really important I then go on to talk about the formal aspect, because a mixed register is created by formal and informal aspects, and I've talked about the fact that the formal aspect I've been really specific about how that formal aspect has been created in that French Latinate lexis, the polysyllabic lexis. I've provided specific examples, and then I've talked about the fact that you have obviously the primary and the secondary purpose of the show, and that secondary purpose is the fact that although in this article in text C they are trying to sort of entertain the viewers, they also they also want to get those viewers to watch it and take it seriously, and it's not just a joke and a laugh at the end of the day. It's funny, but it's also there is a purpose behind the text. It's intentional. Now, moving on to the next paragraph, TextC also uses Lexis to create a mixed register. For example, radio staff, right? We're halfway through, and so far we've travelled to the depths of space and exciting new baddies along the way. The use of synthetic personalisation along with the metaphorical language of travelling through space creates the impression of a collective adventure that all viewers have gone through. Additionally, the use of high-frequency Lexis baddies, traditionally used in childish contexts, adds a sense of playfulness to the text. So again, they've talked about I've talked about the synthetic personalisation and also the use of the baddie and how the fact that it's looking at the context of that word, and by using that word, they've intentionally sort of created playfulness, childlike sort of feature to the text, and that light-hearted sort of nature. Moving on to the next paragraph, the more formal aspect of the register is partially created by Carr and Braxton's use of Lexis. For example, Carr references designers and past actors like Ray Holman and David Tennant. This adds an element of knowledge power to the text, which is expected since as an expert critic, Carr's audience expect to receive new pieces of information. Additionally, the use of French Latin Lexis, like the in the pre-modified noun phrase, nation's collective consciousness, and Braxton's use of the collocation tour de force, adds a precise specialist register, which implies that both Carr and Braxton are highly informed and capable of reviewing the show due to their detailed insight. So throughout this sort of text, you will have noticed that I've been sort of referring to the writer's sort of playfulness, their informality, sort of the colloquial sort of phrases, the euphemisms, etc. But then I do sort of return back to the fact that they are sort of specialist critics. They know what they're doing, and it's really important to sort of highlight that, and that they show that sort of expertise through these sort of little tidbits that I've added here. So I've talked about the pre-modified noun phrase. I've talked about the collocation, and how that creates, how those sort of, I've talked very specifically about the Lexis and how that Lexis is then creating a precise specialist register. So it's not just a formal register, it's a precise specialist register, because that precise specialist register is working specifically to show that these critics are highly informed and they are actually competent, and they're able to review that show. Notably, however, despite both Carr and Braxton's writing having elements of formality, they also balance this with informality to entertain their audience as well. For example, Braxton includes the parenthetical aside, marvellous two men. The use of spoken Lexis, meh, in the written text shows how increasing informalisation has blurred the lines between speech and text. So again, I think that's the end of the response. So when I've talked about that, again, adding in that sort of parenthetical aside and that spoken Lexis, again, which is very me showing how I'm specific there. I'm not just saying they've used the phrase or the word meh. I've said it's spoken Lexis used in the written text, and that's informalisation. Again, that's sort of a concept that is being used, and I'm adding that concept in. Now, just sort of looking at and adding a few points from the examiner's report, it's so they've sort of given some feedback on what they're looking for, and I'll try and add in like a screenshot or something on the text, so you can have a look as well, and I'll link it in the caption. But essentially, what they have said this year, they've highlighted the fact that candidates were able to consider discourse features, sentence and lexical choices with ease, and that comparisons were increasingly based on linguistic features, but some candidates did fall back into comparisons around audience, purpose and mode. So what they've said is that they want you to sort of be comparing primarily based on the discourse feature. So text B and C are different because of this discourse feature or this sentence or this lexical choice, and they don't want you to sort of compare text B and C based on sort of comparisons around audience or purpose or mode, because you want to talk about that. You need to talk about the audience and the purpose and the mode, but that's obviously not comparing the two. That's obviously talking within the text, if that makes sense, hopefully. So in this examiner's report, they've also mentioned the fact that these sorts of successful approaches were looking to integrate relevant concepts, and that the most successful candidates utilised concepts in a way that illuminated their analysis overall, and that candidates are increasingly able to link their discussion of context with the linguistic levels they are analysing, and there are fewer standalone contextual paragraphs this year. So there's obviously a lot more information in that examiner's report, and you can have a read through at your own leisure. I hope that this was really helpful and useful for you, and I will come back hopefully with the next video, and the next video will actually be going through paper 1, but it will be going through question 2. I've not gone through question 2 yet because I felt that this question 3 was more important. So hopefully you've enjoyed that, and let me know if you'd anything else that you'd like to see in the comments.